So
I'm super happy to be here today with Marty, who I met in the comment section, and I was just really enthused about his comments because it pointed out to me that he has a lot of missing pieces for the kind of work that I'm doing, and so I wanted to talk to Marty. And Marty, usually what we start with here is we have people kind of tell their story, how they came to where they are today, and so I'd kind of like to have you talk about that if you could, and then we'll talk about. I think we're going to talk mainly about Wolfgang Smith, but we'll probably get into some other things as well.
Yes, of course. I made a comment very simply. You mentioned ideology, and you've been musing about that in many different ways. Of course, there's many different ways we can even define that, but understanding your definition and Christianity, I made a comment that Christianity is an ideology unless we truly understand Judaism. So that's what provoked. And then you said, tell me more. And we went down a thread, and I'll probably follow that thread a little bit. Coming to I was born during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so that puts me, and my brother, who was a year and a half, was born on the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But both of us were German immigrant sons. We spoke German in my home. My mother was from East Prussia. She lost everything to the Russians. And my father from Yugoslavia, but they were German people. And they ended up in a little Baptist church in Cleveland, Ohio. And they were my parents were tailors and my uncles were tool and die makers. And so that's the world I grew up with, a Baptist church, very into understanding theology, understanding Christianity. But they were the Germans who suffered immensely, and they didn't seem to fit in with some of the other waves of immigrants, but they came to Cleveland to work. And so I grew up in this context, and I remember as a small child watching The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, and it was like a horror film to me. So we began the discussion, of course, of the Holocaust, and being a German, it's a taboo subject, but not with my church, because they were Polish Germans, East Prussian Germans, and I pleasantly found out that in our church, they were trying to reconcile, and they didn't really know what was going on. So my grandfather was a tailor master in Yugoslavia, and he had Jewish apprentices and Muslim apprentices, and they worked together. So these are the stories I heard as a child. So I saw that there were Germans that were not Nazis, and I was proud of that. And I always looked upon the Jews as something very special, and it kind of fit within what we have as dispensational theology. So when I made a commitment for Christ to follow him, it was actually a Keith Green memorial concert. He was a Jew. And then there was also Jews for Jesus, who I was supporting, and they asked me to go on an outreach. And I denied to go on an outreach with Jews for Jesus because I just said, why should I preach the gospel to the Jews when they gave us the gospel? They gave us Jesus. And it was kind of like a hold this thought moment, 1983. So I went to the nations, as Keith Green told us to do before he was killed in that plane crash. And they made those memorial concerts. And I had this literature in my hand after I brought my youth group there, and said they needed machinists, tool and die and welders on this ship. So I joined the Doulos ship as a machinist in 1984. I did that for a year. And then, of course...
Now, wait a minute. The Doulos ship was part of Operation Mobilization?
Correct.
And just for the people who don't know what that is, could you explain that?
Yeah, these were missionary book ships. Sometimes you hear about the Mercy ships. We were the book ships. And we worked very close with the Mercy ships, YWAM. It was founded by a man named George Verwer, who's still alive today. And the director at the time was George Miley and Frank Dietz. And these people made tremendous impacts upon my life. And then just being able to come to Europe again, because I had been in Europe in 1981, and I had come to Europe often as a child. And I saw already the secularism of Europe. I saw the taboos of my German family. And I grew up always wondering and wanting to preach the gospel to them, but they could care less. They were happy as atheists, and they had everything they needed. So I went to Austria. And in differentiating ourselves from Jehovah's Witnesses, we would go door to door with music, and I could play the guitar. So I would sing at door to door, telling people about Jesus. And the town I was working in was called Judenburg, and I found out the history was like a Jewish enclave during the medieval times, and it had some history in there. So I always had this Jewish haunting thought, but I said, I'm not going to go there. I studied at a school called Prairie Bible Institute in Canada. It was very dispensational, and you just started seeing things unravel there. Of the evangelical Billy Graham generation that I grew up in. And you saw the postmodernity issue being very front and center. Then I went back to OM Ships. My wife and I had been married. Our daughter was born in Three Hills, and I went back to what was called the Logos 2, and I worked there for 3 years. And at that time, I was seeing missiology as very social science oriented. So I decided to go study in a Reformed seminary in Orlando, Florida, because I had always been interested in Francis Schaeffer. I've read all his books at that time, and I was also very interested in a theologian called R.C. Sproul. So when I entered the Reformed seminary, I knew right away I was becoming into a very highly intellectual approach to the faith. But I also found out that they didn't like to be known as supersessionists, and they didn't like dispensationalists, but they liked to be known as fulfillment theologians. And
okay,
sure,
so we need to stop here for a second, because a lot of this terminology is it goes a little bit over my head, although I have a slight grasp of it. For a lot of people who are listening, they're not going to know what those three things mean. So